Hi everyone, I hope you're all doing great. This is Daria Strategy and I'm happy to have Carsten Munk from the Cartesi Foundation as a guest for the interview today. He's a board member responsible for the new frontiers for scaling computation and transcending EVM limitations. Today we'll discuss Cartesi for builders, the main alternatives to Ethereum Virtual Machine in building the apps, the biggest challenges for the upcoming bull run, and the diversity of the Web3 culture. Tell me please about your career, about your background, and how you joined Cartesi Foundation.
I'm a computer scientist by trade, and after I finished university, I've been doing a lot of open source work, especially within the area of mobile Linux, and I got a contract from Nokia to basically join to work on them with their Linux-based mobile phones, which existed at that point back in 2009. And then after Nokia did a bit of a strategic mistake and went away from the Linux-based phones and went to Windows Phone, I joined a startup called Yola, where we built an alternative to Android. And then after around 5 years there, I was excited about blockchain and what was happening in this area, and we went ahead back in, I think it was 2017, 2018 something, to start my own company called Zippy, which I'm still in. And as part of that work, we're doing Web3 things and kind of understanding that we need, let's say, to scale things, especially, let's say, to let's say, enough customers, for example, in a place like Kenya where we're doing products, we needed off-chain computation because basically the Ethereum chain didn't scale at that time, still doesn't scale to the amount of simplicity and, let's say, computation and also expressibility that is actually needed to, let's say, make applications nowadays, and not that just spend time coding on EVM or something like that. And during the course of that, I found Cartesi. This was about 2 years ago, and I kind of approached them from a customer point of view, and how they can how their technology can be used in, let's say, in a real life setting. And we started a grant because they contributed to the software, and then in July last year, I joined as a board member of the Cartesi Foundation.
Can you explain how foundation works? Because we all know that Ethereum Foundation, Cartesi Foundation, all these foundations in blockchain. So how everything works in Cartesi?
Yeah, so just like there's many blockchains out there, there's many different types of foundations, right? Like there's the very controlling kind of foundations where, let's say, that Ethereum has let's say, a lot of people working kind of directly for them to some extent. In the Cartesi ecosystem, the Cartesi Foundation is just another participant in the ecosystem. Of course, there's a treasury and so on like this, but in terms of, besides protecting stuff like the trademark and so on, like most of the kind of it's not a top-down decision-making process. Is meant to be kind of like a decentralized ecosystem, and we are just there to kind of help make things easier, right? Because there's only so much you can do with, let's say, DAO structures nowadays, or voting and grants programs, that sometimes it helps having somebody who can, once in a while go to a bank and set up an account and make transfers from there, because not everybody can kind of set up their businesses completely with cryptocurrency nowadays. And mostly we focus around kind of just, let's say, management of grants, treasury, trademark, but one big part is, of course, still marketing, because doing decentralized marketing is a bit of a nightmare because many people have so many, let's say, different ideas and incentives. So, of course, we can trying to highlight what's available in, let's say, happening in the ecosystem, and also to some extent set brand and work with marketing companies and those kind of things. So it is, let's say, an organization that kind of seeks to be there as a service to the people who are developing Cartesi and building on top of it, and so.
How do you attract these developers, engineers, cryptographers to your ecosystem?
That's always the challenge with kind of new things, because as you probably know, the Ethereum Virtual Machine is let's say, the golden standard for what people program against nowadays. But what is kind of like happening at the moment is that I feel that that the total pie of like EVM developers out there that are doing like, for example, Solidity and so on, it's about 23,000 people, and the kind of like the amount of people have kind of stopped growing because we have reached the level of, let's say, how good the tools can get to some extent, how easy it is to develop it. This is why, for example, we've seen a lot of like a surge in people doing, for example, let's say Rust in other blockchains, because it's like it's a little more mainline. It doesn't rely on, let's say, a single team at the Ethereum Foundation to do things. And I think that where Cartesi fits into this kind of like alternative virtual machine angle is that that practically we are just like a normal computer, right? Like you can write software like you would run it and deploy it into a cloud, except that the execution of this is actually, let's say, verifiable into a blockchain. And I think that that's attractive to people because like a lot of things in blockchain end up being that you're spending more time working on things related to the Ethereum virtual machine, like the languages, Solidity and so on, than building your own business value, right? Like it should be more like 10%. Like it's a little bit like you have to kind of like run your own servers and your own computer and all that kind of like and make your own compilers and those kind of things. And this doesn't feel right that a project needs to be, let's say, almost a startup in itself, making a new area in a blockchain. It should be something like it's like 10% of the time you spend. Rest of the time is spent making your own customers happy, right? And that's where I think that let's say Cartesi is interesting to people because it's simple. Let's say simpler to work with. Should be simpler in the future. The problem with Cartesi has been a little bit that we haven't been that known that we exist, and at the same time we actually have quite a solid product, which is the Cartesi Virtual Machine in this particular case. And now that people are starting to know us, more and more people are playing with things that were normally impossible in, let's say, in zero knowledge proofs and in EVM and even in, let's say, in things like Solana and Rust, and seeing, let's say, what can actually be made verifiable and interesting. And this is what I think attracts people.
I know that you launched the grant program. Tell a little bit about this, and I think that it's also a part of this developers attraction.
Yes, I think from a grant program point of view, so this is where let's say, I might have a little bit different view on it because I come from kind of open source communities and so on, because I remember in the kind of like in the original, let's say, heydays or whatever you say it, of open source, they said that, well, if you make an open source project, like people from all over the world will come in and contribute to it, right? Except it very, very quickly became an attention game. That it became about that yes, there might be people who can contribute out to it there, but you can't expect that there will be entirely a swarm of people always available on a big side, a swarm of people available to kind of improve your product. And this is one of the reasons why I got very interested in, let's say, in tokens and blockchain, because I identify that there's kind of like, for traditional open source, there's only two ways, right? Like there's either that a big company takes it under their wings and they essentially sponsor the work, or that, let's say, people do it for free and they're essentially unpaid and it's not very sustainable. So the whole focus on tokens, incentives, and grants in blockchain space is refreshing in this way because it enables us to finance public goods. And this is what the Cartesi Grants program is about. Like we are financing public goods. But naturally it has to be financed public goods that are kind of like related to kind of Cartesi, right? And at the same time, there's many challenges with grants programs about basically that there's a little bit like, how do I say, grant surfers to some extent, like people that go out and kind of propose not the most amazing projects to kind of like do something, and you kind of need to find out what actually makes, let's say, an impact for your ecosystem and doing things. So we have some really amazing kind of like talent coming out from around the world to kind of come in and request grants and so on. But to make it concrete, we have a grants program. We probably in the future we'll focus more on kind of like on RFPs, as in the proposals that people can come in and kind of like bid into to some extent to do. But we also kind of like have a more open grants program where people can propose things, and there's certain milestones. These things have to be public goods, as in it has to be open source, it has to be beneficiary for everybody. Just like, let's say Cartesi Foundation's own grantees, they're required to open source what they're doing. Because if it's just something that's happening on your computer somewhere and you're deploying it and it's not available to the rest of the world, then like, why should we push that forward, right? And we have a very nice site called, where we're using Chamverse, which is also a Web3 native grants service that to kind of like facilitate this going forward. And basically everybody's let's say welcome to come and kind of propose grants that are related to something they think they can do uniquely in this space.
You mentioned about Cartesi Virtual Machine. Can you explain in more details why is it unique and how it works?
Where Cartesi is special is that it implements what's called RISC-V. RISC-V is like an instruction set on architecture, like for example you have Intel or you have ARM processors nowadays, but the difference is that RISC-V is open source. There's existing, let's say, tools for it, there's running actual hardware with it, and because it's RISC-V and it's a fairly complete or general purpose RISC-V, it essentially means that you can run something like, let's say, like Ubuntu Linux and verify it to a blockchain, right? And it's very, very powerful because you don't need to, let me contrast this a little bit, let's say, because there's another thing that's, for example, called WebAssembly, right? WebAssembly is something that runs in browsers, it runs on many different processors and so on. But as an application gets bigger and bigger, essentially what happens anyway is that you're implementing almost like a small operating system inside your application. And then why not just use an existing, let's say, Linux or operating system that already exists to kind of base your things on. And this is why we think it's kind of unique, because you can use essentially the last 60 years of computing and tools and libraries and everything like that, and it just basically works. It's not very different than, let's say, uploading something to a cloud. And this is where I think Cartesi Machine is amazing, because we can essentially stop thinking about that we're doing this on blockchain, and we're just thinking about, well, this is just a temporary computer that runs something for us out there, and everybody, when running it, will get the same result. And that's why I think it's unique. And also it's unique because it is something that is not a new technology. It has been developed almost since 2018 and is stable. I mean, I have not managed to outright crash this thing myself. It's something that just works, and it's also testable, and your program would essentially run almost the same way as it does on real hardware.
You choose optimistic instead of zk rollups.
First off, there's no reason why you can't, let's say, prove the execution of a Cartesi machine in zero knowledge, right? It's not the most fast in the world, right? But back when kind of like Cartesi project started, zk was very immature at that point. Things have gotten better, let's say with projects like RISC-0, which also implemented RISC-V, but not, let's say, it kind of got Linux, at least at the moment. And our focus was originally on making very bigger computations, and with zero knowledge proofs, it's much more about, let's say, the smaller computations, right? Like, let's say I want to prove a block, but let's say if you want to, for example, one thing that's really, really difficult right now in zero knowledge is, for example, I want to prove the execution of a large language model, right? It's tons of RAM, it's tons of computing, and it's just really, really expensive to do in this way. And with optimistic's rollups might have a constraint in that they take longer time to settle, because you need to kind of like have challenges and all that kind of things, versus zero knowledge proof is like instant settlement in this particular case. But they are to some extent easier to explain and to some extent easier to secure, because I love zero knowledge proofs and they're amazing, but it's also worth noting that from a technical point of view, they're not, let's say, as solidly understood as, let's say, an optimistic virtual machine, because everybody can run this computation again themselves locally and understand what the state is supposed to be, versus if something goes wrong in zero knowledge proof, then basically it's game over, right? So this is kind of like how the angle looks like. But Cartesi machine itself is, from a technical point of view, agnostic to it. It's just that roll-ups has kind of been a base to it. And I think that as we are getting into more things like, let's say, shared sequences like Espresso and running many kind of like, let's say, a million app chains, I think optimistic will be the easier way to do things, because then it becomes more about, let's say, there are different app chains proving to each other certain things, and you don't need to run everything to zero knowledge proof, because basically everybody will know that, well, this is basically how the world looks like, right? Because we can kind of replay it. And I don't know, we'll see. And also with things like Eigenlayer coming along, like it might be easier for many people or to just basically get a vote on, let's say, what is my roll-up state at the moment. And for 99% of cases, I think that's going to be, let's say, reality. So it's all about kind of like how do you configure it, and we try not to give all the answers to some extent, because like in the end of the day, the developer will know best how his application will perform or should perform.
So let's talk about ETHDenver. It was the huge event, and what results or what conclusions did you do after?
The original idea was that basically we are sending people to ETHDenver to hack. Like we all participate in the hackathon, almost all of us, that is, and sit down, work with our own product, kind of like eat our own dog food, and try to make something constructive with it. So we had many teams that were kind of like doing something like one team was doing something around governance, and some other teams were doing stuff around gaming using Cartesi machine, and then my own team, we were doing things around verifiable indexing, because it's a big problem at the moment that with technologies like the graph and so on, like if there's a dispute on, let's say, what an indexer creates of output because indexing is very important in Ethereum, because like the way to access data on Ethereum is really bizarre. And indexing is kind of like a way to bring it closer to normal web developer, right? And the problem is, let's say, if the graph indexer fails at the moment, their resolution process to go out and slash deposits is literally going on a forum, writing your case, and then it's a little bit like a court process, like manual instead. While something where we're doing verifiable indexing, then it's essentially that we end up having Ethereum be the supreme court of things instead. So that's kind of like what we were doing in our hackathon team, and we ended up in top 3 in infrastructure and top 15 in general. We didn't win the main track, but yeah, that's just how it goes once in a while. But I think that basically there's a little bit of disorganization around kind of like how the final things were judged, because there was supposed to be, like, let's say, not just, let's say, per judge picks, which is what happened there. But it is also quite clear that when it comes to Ethereum collaboration and growth, these things happen outside the hackathons these days, like on the side events and in the meetups, and the people who actually sit down and talk about things. Because like this was kind of like the thing, yes, there's only so much you can do in a hackathon and sit down and talk to people, but in the general, people are there to code, right? While being out there and talking to people and collaborating and approaching difficult topics, that's a completely different thing. So I think that's kind of like also the challenge with, let's say, many other events, that there's so many side events and so little bandwidth to actually go there. But like that's basically, like, let's say, how it was. It was my first, let's say, hackathon as a participant to some extent. I have been a judge in the ETH Istanbul before, kind of seeing the basic
I know.
It was a different kind, because the F Global hackathons are a little bit different than some of the kind of like independently organized ones, because F Global are replicating the same recipe everywhere. And this was just a different flavor of it.
Cartesi organized something, in hackathons or
no,
no?
well, we had like we were not a sponsor of ETHDenver this time around. We have been before, but we had like some other events that we were organizing, for example, together with Espresso Systems. That we have a quite nice venue, kind of like getting people together for a cocktail night. And those kind of things where people just get together and actually talk about things is quite good. We also had some gaming related events where, let's say, that location we found as a very important thing. That we got a lot of passionate people, but we didn't get let's say many because the location was kind of a little bit outside the city and so on. So that's also something when you have raging events about these things that you really need to understand how those people's challenges in getting to your event actually look like. Like if it's on the other side of the city, despite being an amazing venue, it might not, let's say, help. But it was a great event anyway.
How do you choose your side events to participate in?
Yeah, so from my point of view, as it's typically where I'm going to speak, for example, right? Like because
it's the best way.
That kind of like helps in this way. It kind of depends on kind of like what your expected audience of the side events. Like are there gonna be people that you want to talk to? Like I went to an event where there was mostly just VCs and business development people, and I wanted to talk to builders, for example, instead in the space. And I think that there's also a little bit of soul searching needed in event space in Web3 at the moment, because this spreading out of events and presence and so on has kind of gone a little bit overboard. And I think it should be more about, like, for example, Expresso organized this Beyond the Base Layer event, which was actually like good talks, good panels, actual like premium content. So where people actually sit down and discuss about things. I think that makes more sense. But that also needs to kind of balance with if, let's say, that the normal event is also, let's say, presentation heavy, because right now it ends up in that all the speakers are just tired in the end, and just doing like the big things in Ethereum happens when people sit down and brainstorm together.
This community, Web3 and crypto and blockchain community, is it closed community, or you think that it's easy to enter?
There's a difference between if you're in it for the passion or you're in it to earn a living, right? To some extent, like you can have both, right? But I think that the problem of, for example, let's make an example with layer 2s, right? Like there are so many layer 2s out there. We all kind of trying to solve the same problems, and it's a little bit like more it's a competitive, and because we are striking for the attention of investors and developers and so
definitely,
on.
yeah.
And it's like it's not pretty once in a while, because now I'm kind of like seeing, let's say, two different kind of like communities here. Like I'm seeing the Ethereum layer 2 communities and the Bitcoin layer 2 communities as well, because like they are technically very different creatures to some extent, right? And I think it turns off developers that it is sometimes a little bit hostile, right? Like I don't like that some projects like I intentionally don't choose projects where I feel like that the main leads of it are acting in a kind of asshole way, because when I got into Ethereum, the reason why I liked Ethereum compared to Bitcoin was that in Ethereum it's extremely welcoming. Even people that are deep in the space help each other. And in Bitcoin I felt it was much more hostile, kind of like, let's say, almost player versus player kind of like thing.
Do you see the difference between Web3 culture and degen culture?
I to some extent have a little bit of an impression that the degen culture to some extent always has existed, except it was typically kind of like more investments and those kind of things that people basically just that culture basically just got much more public and aware. I'm a builder by nature, like I don't trade that much myself. But But there's really amazing people once in a while that does good analysis of things and kind of like looks at things in this regard. And I don't blame people because like, at least here in Europe, like we had like outright negative interest rates on our account. So basically anything. I'm not sure so much that, let's say, you can put everything under the Web3 umbrella, because at the end of the day, like what I liked was the idea of the world computer to some extent. Now I think it's moving more to kind of like be a world cloud and what this enables. And I think whatever ideals kind of like people are putting on top of that and use cases and so on, it's not something I'm deeply involved in. I liked seeing a lot kind of like also what people were experimenting with in NFT culture and so on. But in the end of the day, like this is just new fabric of, let's say, to some extent, human existence that we have now, and people will do strange things on them. There'll be outlier, strange projects out there. Now that we're coupling with, let's say, things like large language models and image generation and video generation and so on, it becomes even stranger. And I think these things basically, let's say, get merged into each other over time, essentially.
Do you see how Web3 or degen, or let's call it Web3 culture, impacts and influences global culture?
We have built, let's say, these trustless third-party organizations that don't really work anymore. And at this particular point in time, I think that the only hope we to some extent have for the world is to be able to move these away from us and be able to kind of like have more approachable justice to some extent. And I think that over time, more and more things will be, let's say, anchored into blockchain. Of course, there will always be a social layer in one way or the other, but I should be able to have, let's say, a social layer together with somebody in China, in Ukraine, in Europe, not something that's kind of like necessarily decided by, let's say, the borders that have been divided up once in a while, that we have to understand like what's the way forward. And if there's anything people understand, it's economic consequence of things.
What is the biggest challenge for Cartesi during the upcoming bull run? What do you think?
I think it's the usual game of attention, to be honest. Like from technological point of view, we are not in a bad shape to some extent. Like, of course, our development, let's say, approachability and documentation and so on, that's always like good to fix. I think the biggest challenge is being out there, being part of a narrative, and making people understand that this is actually, like, let's say, an acceptable way of developing blockchain applications. Because I mean, I'm annoyed, as in just a simple example about like, why can't I set up a family album, have it deployed, let's say, in decentralized way, encrypted way, in an easy way? Mm-hmm. Like, why is such things like the basic use cases of, let's say, decentralized technology, why is it not there? Why do I still need to go to, let's say, to Facebook to share it with my family? I think the biggest challenge is UX, deep down. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. It needs to be something where it's good. Like, thankfully, things like passkeys have finally come around. Things like identity, but also stuff like getting in and out of the system is starting to get better, like with, let's say, companies like, let's say, RAM network, etc. And like, it's getting easier to kind of like do things in a reasonable way, or even, let's say, having cards. But yeah. I think the biggest challenge is UX, developer experience, and security, right? Security is kind of like what it all comes down to, because nobody wants to lose their money on a regular basis. And even when the professionals are losing their value, then there's a problem, right? But yeah, the biggest challenge for Cartesi is basically getting out there, getting adoption. We think we have something useful, something that people will appreciate, and there will be a leap in how we do things. But let's see.
Yeah, but I think that UX and developer experience and security are the main challenges for all blockchain community, for all projects.
Of course it is, because nobody has solved it. Like the Microsoft Windows, or let's say the Mac OS of of blockchain has not appeared yet, right? Like it's still like you're still mumbling around with thousands of different systems and so on. It's a mess. And this is also where, let's say, the modular narrative to some extent plays in better, because it's the realization that not people can't build their own kingdoms, right? You need to build a garden instead. And this is why it's fantastic we have, let's say, a project like Celestia, Espresso, LVMs like Cartesi, archival things like, let's say, for Filecoin, for example, other kind of networks that are kind of like useful to do things, or even, let's say, zk, distributed clusters, or those kind of technologies. That basically, when you put them together and each party is doing what they're best at, then you end up with a combination that might actually be very, very good, because in the past with L1s, everybody was trying to build their own kingdom, and it doesn't work.
How do you see the future of blockchain in context of mass-oriented applications or products?
Blockchain is not necessarily the right way, let's say, right mental model for people to approach Web3 applications, things like sequencers and let's say data publishing, data broadcast, which it actually is much more understandable to people. Like it's a broadcast that you can't take down, essentially, right? It's a little bit like I can, if I wanted to today, I could actually go out and make a radio station that gets broadcast around the world that you can't take down, right? And there's a history of it and everything, and it's actually, to some extent, it's easier to explain than, let's say, tokens and everything else. I mean, yes, you can be paying for let's say broadcast, but and I think that once those qualities become so easy, and they are starting to get really, really easy for people to actually adopt and use, especially in terms of, let's say, things like Cartesi and being able to easily build these things out, these things will start seeping in as people see value in them, right? That's a huge problem also today. That, let's say that I might have a startup, right? People will increasingly get to the point where they don't trust startups because they're just going to go down and disappear, right? And how can you still build a good business on that, right? And I think that it will start to matter more and more and more, the access to, let's say, to justice, to history, to, let's say, non-vendor login things, especially as, let's say, Apple and Google are kind of tightening the news about applications and so on. And I think that this is kind of like how I think that these things will start seeping in, just like, let's say, NFTs seeped in for a while in many areas as well.
Do you have any favorite projects built on Cartesi?
Like, I like the things that are happening within, let's say, verifiable LLMs, as in, let's say, something that is almost completely impossible in zero-knowledge proofs, because I think that we're getting to a point where, let's say, we have NFTs in the beginning, right? Like CryptoKitties and so on, and when they make new combination of them and so on. But now imagine you can actually, let's say, almost have, let's say, on-chain verified, let's say, almost like beings that are basically running a little bit like a thought process of their own and kind of like doing things. So it gets kind of interesting. It's a little bit like creating, let's say, decentralized, let's say, life to some extent. And I think that's a very, very interesting kind of like use case of the Cartesi technology. Of course, it is like not necessarily the fastest in the world, something like that, but I think it's something where it can be a way to explore completely new kind of like design angles. I like a lot of the kind of like the games and the creativity that people put into them. By that it has been a little bit locked in Ethereum space because of the lack of expressibility in the EVM and so on.
Maybe you can name the projects you follow now. I mean, not only from Cartesi ecosystem, but in general.
Yeah, well, of course I'm following all the L2s, right? Because like I need to keep aware of what people are doing. Like, but it's just, in terms of kind of like my favorite projects that I'm watching of kind of like what they're doing. I like what zkSync is doing because they're doing a kind of like a compiler angle to doing EVM and so on blockchain. I like what Zero is doing because they are trying to lower the bar for writing ZK applications. I am following us for, of course, also on Bitcoin side, the whole BitVM thing, which is kind of like enabling verifiable computing, kind of participating with that as well. All the stuff coming out of eigenlayer stuff, Espresso, Celestia, Avail, because they want the developability, Filecoin.
What can you recommend to people who are interested in Web3 and they don't know where to start?
Oh, I mean, the traditional way is kind of like that to join some of the local meetups sometimes. It really depends once in a while if some of the talks are kind of like more marketing oriented or more technical and so on. But sometimes it's about sitting down talking to people. Joining a hackathon is always kind of like a good way to kind of like get to know some people in the space. But in general, Web3 is all about, it's a context sport, right? Like you need to sit down and play with it and understand how it can be used. And then, I mean, reading articles, some of the classic Andreas Antonopoulos, I can't say his name correctly, talks that he did about Bitcoin and blockchain and so on in the early days are really, really good to kind of like understand.
What do you read or listen to or watch to relax and take your time?
Yeah, so reading, it's like I've been reading a lot of science fiction in general because the science fiction is people speculating about how the future could look like, alternative realities and so on. And that's essentially what, in the end of the day, like something like Web3 is about, right? Like that we imagine different ways of doing things. In terms of listening, nowadays it's mostly about podcasts and so on. Instead, like it's more work related because like when you have a family, that's limited amount of time you have to kind of just sit down with a book, right? But myself, like I watch way too much Star Trek and X-Files and those kind of things. So that's just what or like old shows like The West Wing, to just kind of like spend time, relax with. But when you are in Web3, there's no such thing as an 8 to 16 job. It's from when you wake up and when you go to sleep, and yeah, that's basically it. But if I was to kind of suggest something else for people to do is actually go out there and talk to people in many different places. Don't go to places as a tourist. Go and talk to, let's say, the people who are local to some of these events. Like there's a point to why, let's say, that Ethereum conferences are kind of like in more special places, because we need to see how this stuff is global and how some things are challenging. Yeah. I have a special, let's say, affection for, let's say, Africa and Kenya because they already had digital, let's say, money and so on, and how, let's say, some of the problems that, let's say, Web3 can actually fix there, and you really need to spend time on the ground and talking to people to really understand that this is where the real impact comes from.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for this interview. It was really insightful, and I'm sure that people will learn a lot of things.